In this lecture, we look at accountability and legitimacy strategies, with particular reference to principal agent theory and the case studies of the United States and China. Principal agent theory is often utilized in international relations literature to study the relationship between states and international organizations. Nevertheless, we can apply principal agent theory to explain state and NGO relations. States act as principals that provide a temporary transfer of authority to NGOs as agents. States delegate authority to NGOs in order to deliver public services, including relief and developmental aid, due to their perceived expertise and efficiency. The question we need to ask ourselves is as follows. Why do principals, the states in this example, delegate to NGOs as their agents? What mechanisms do states use to try and control NGOs? And do control mechanisms utilized by states limit NGO autonomy? Applying principal agent theory, we can contend that the most important control mechanism that states have over NGOs is the power of the purse, where principals can threaten to withhold funding from NGOs that do not act in accordance with their expectations. In addition, states control NGOs by utilizing specific mechanisms such as earmarking and coordination, which acts to reduce NGOs' autonomy and compels them to act in ways that differ from their principles. Through earmarking, a principal can dictate how and where aid will be used. Oftentimes, principals through earmarking can control aid delivery down to the region, state, or even a specific project, which limits the sort of programming and geographical autonomy of NGOs. NGOs that accept funding from states are exposed to a marketization of NGO activities, which includes the use of competitive tenders and renewable contracts. Marketization has resulted in NGOs having to compete for contracts, often in the short term. This causes NGOs to distort information about success and failure of their activities. It can lead NGOs to engage in behavior that is contrary to their normative agendas. Furthermore, when NGOs are subjected to competitive and renewable contracts, they respond similarly as for-profit organizations. Namely, they have concerns of securing funds outweighing other concerns, including ethics, project efficiency, or self-criticism. Principals attempt to control agents, particularly in the areas of financing, undermine NGOs' ethical and normative objectives, and limit their autonomy. When we adopt the principal agent approach, we can also articulate this idea that NGO dependence on government funding may make the organizations less likely to work in poorly governed states. The dependence of NGOs as an agent on funding from governments as principals may act to influence NGOs' aid allocation decisions. Since continued funding from donors is often contingent on how successful a particular NGO is deemed to be by the donor, NGOs may be more likely to allocate aid in less difficult environments in order to ensure that their projects will be successful. While we have emphasized how principals utilize control mechanisms that act to limit NGOs' autonomy, some other scholars may argue that NGOs do have agency and they can influence principals. Central to principal agency theory is the idea that the preferences of principals and agents are hardly ever perfectly aligned, and that agents will try to pursue their private interests. Principals develop control mechanisms in order to constrain opportunistic agency behavior, but such control devices are typically imperfect. Resources are scarce and principals never dedicate sufficient time or effort to control agents entirely. Therefore, agents always possess a certain margin for autonomous action. Agents can become actors and utilize strategies to gain autonomy. What we're suggesting here is that NGOs have power in their relationship with principals that they can utilize to maintain their autonomy. NGOs have specialized expertise that principals like states need, and NGOs' ability to exploit this information gives them power. NGOs can gain autonomy as a result of also having multiple principals, for example, states, international organizations, individual donors. Having multiple principals give NGOs more power by allowing them to exploit the differences among them, which allows them to utilize the rules of the principles that best matches the interests of the NGOs. NGOs do have agency independent of states, which they define as the ability to choose among different courses of action, to learn from previous experience, and to effect change. For example, NGOs have agency in issues of issue definition and agenda setting. As a result, NGOs can play an important role in issue framing in order to convince states to alter their positions. NGOs also demonstrate agency from states as a result of their ideational sort of methods of influence, in which they pursue normative change by reframing problems as global rather than the sole interests of states. We can suggest there are two strategies in particular that NGOs can utilize to pursue their private interests and increase their autonomy in their relationship with principals. The first is at the project level, in which NGOs attempt to stop or change the conditions of a particular project. In this scenario, NGOs will accept a contract from a principal to carry out a specific project and attempt to halt or change the conditions of the project once contracted. The second level of influence occurs at the policymaking level. Principals often give NGOs as a sort of an advisory role and invite them to participate in project and program reviews in which NGOs can provide advice and policy recommendations. The two strategies here often overlap with NGOs first accepting the funding from a principal to actually carry out the project, which in turn leads to a debate within the NGO about the principal policies resulting within the NGO engaging with the principal. To better understand how accountability and legitimacy plays out in practice, we're going to look at two case studies. The first case study is looking at the US case, and then we're going to follow this up with the case of China. So first, the US case. Since its creation in 1961, the United States Agency for International Development and Relief, USAID, has relied on NGOs to deliver U.S. foreign aid in order to promote development and relief programs abroad. This relationship was reinforced in 1973 with the passage of the New Directions Mandate, which called for USAID to provide NGOs with financial assistance in order to broaden their overseas developmental activities. In 1981, the relationship between NGOs and USAID was further strengthened when Congress passed legislation requiring that at least 13.5% of the government expenditure for development and relief activities be channeled through NGOs. In recent years, USAID has gone beyond this by allocating over 30% of its total budget to NGOs. Now, it's really interesting how to become eligible for USAID funding. To do so, NGOs must first register with the government, and to maintain their status, they must submit a number of documents every year, including annual reports, annual budget, audited financial statements, Internal Revenue Service documents, as well as a report indicating that the U.S. NGO receives at least 20% of its income from private sources. This is mandated by Congress. The U.S. has delegated authority to NGOs for development and relief aid distribution due to NGOs' perceived strengths. One of the primary reasons is due to their ability to reach the poorest and neediest recipients, or we could call them hidden populations. The U.S. government also utilizes NGOs as agents since they are perceived to be cost-effective due to their sort of lack of large bureaucracies, which is often common in government aid agencies, and this can act to slow or hamper aid delivery. Additionally, U.S. delegates to NGOs, mainly because of their years of experience and level of expertise in developmental and relief work. As discussed, principal-agent theory indicates that principals implement a number of control mechanisms in order to govern agent behavior, and USAID's relationship with NGOs is no different. There are three primary ways in which USAID, as principal, attempts to control NGOs as agents that act to limit NGOs' autonomy, including the power off or the power to withdraw funds, funding mechanisms, earmarking, and political restrictions. Evidence indicate that USAID has threatened to withdraw funds from NGOs that refuse to cooperate with specific USAID directives that often reflect political rather than practical concerns. In addition, USAID has a number of funding mechanisms that vary in regards to the level of autonomy they afford NGOs. USAID uses three mechanisms to deliver foreign assistance funds to NGOs, including contracts, grants, and cooperative agreements. Contracts are usually awarded competitively in order to provide goods and services meeting USAID conditions, and they require heavy USAID involvement in program design and implementation. Grants are also usually awarded competitively. However, unlike contract, NGOs are free to implement a program independently of USAID involvement. Cooperative agreements are also usually awarded competitively, and they tend to represent a middle ground between contracts and grants. They require limited USAID involvement in program and design and implementation, such as the right for USAID to approve the work plan and the hiring of essential personnel, which is less USAID involvement required by a contract, but more involvement than is required with a grant. In addition, USAID often funds unsolicited NGO proposals, which allows NGOs to design assistance programs relatively independently within wider parameters. USAID also controls NGOs through earmarking funds. Earmarking allows USAID to dictate where and how assistance will be used by identifying regions, states, operations, or projects that qualify for USAID funding, providing with the U.S. with the opportunity to pursue its foreign policy interests. USAID often earmarks funds to states that are deemed important to U.S. security rather than to states that are in the most need. This acts to limit NGOs' autonomy both in a programmatic sort of fashion and a geographical fashion. In addition to determining where aid goes, USAID also places restrictions on where NGOs can go as a result of political considerations. This was quite prevalent during the Cold War, where the US government did not allow NGOs that receive federal subsidies to work in Cuba or Vietnam or North Korea due to their sort of political regime type. Control mechanisms implemented by the US government could act to confirm worst fears regarding the autonomy of state-funded NGOs. The relationship between state funders and NGOs is typically hegemonic, with state-funded NGOs becoming implementers of state policy. States compel NGOs to act in ways that counter their principles due to the fact that states fund NGOs to further their foreign policy goals. Although states might support an NGO as a donor, states as principals through earmarking or other control mechanisms discussed here effectively limit NGOs' programming and geographical autonomy. The use of NGOs as agents by states acts to reduce NGO autonomy and results in the NGOs acting on the behalf of state foreign policy interests. Now, if the United States is successful at controlling and limiting NGOs' autonomy, we would expect US-funded NGOs' developmental activities to reflect US foreign policy interests. The increased dependence of NGOs on state funders has led many to question if the organizations have become the mere implementers of the policy agendas of their state funders. In fact, the former executive director of Oxfam America notes the problems that dependence on government contracts and grants can create for NGOs. So Joseph Short argues, Groups which have contracted with the US government for a long time or who have received a large percentage of their budget from the US government have a government mentality. They think as the government does. Before we delve further into our second case, the case of China, it is necessary to establish the sort of principal concepts we are addressing. So we're looking at accountability and transparency. Accountability is an NGO's liability to its primary stakeholders for the guarantee of its performance. While the term accountability has been widely explored in research, transparency has not received similar attention. Although transparency is widely used, much of the literature falsely assumes a prior knowledge of the term. However, the World Bank defines transparency in the following manner: the increased flow of timely and reliable economic, social, and political information. It incorporates the following elements: access, comprehensiveness, relevance, quality, and reliability. While the notion of accountability and good governance of an organization is still relatively new for many NGOs in China, there is marked distinction between local NGOs and INGOs' behavior and practices. This difference can largely be attributed to the experiences of international NGOs working in various nations that, in addition, draw extensively on the discourse of good governance practices. Chinese NGOs, while achieving some success in servicing the needs of their communities, may have some organizational foundations that can be questionable. While growing individual activism has led to an increased growth of Chinese NGOs, studies conducted by myself and others have suggested that the motivation behind the increase of Chinese NGOs can often be related to personal gains and interests, and not only community ones. Therefore, for many Chinese NGOs, issues of transparency or democratic decision-making is not well considered in the organizational foundation. Moreover, when an organization is going to be accountable or not is directly related to its transparency levels. For example, when we interviewed some NGOs, one representative in particular believed that if the resources were generated from within the organization, then it would not be necessary to be transparent about how the organization operates itself. For other interviewees amongst Chinese NGOs, they equated accountability with that of trust and honesty. There seemed to be a consensus amongst Chinese NGOs who we interviewed that accountability should not be an issue because honesty and trust are the basis of NGOs' work to begin with. While trust and honesty are crucial factors to a better relationship with constituents, it may be a bit naive to believe that the issue of accountability rests on these two characteristics, let alone they are immediately granted by virtue of being seen as an NGO. Throughout many of the interviews and numerous studies, we've also found that several Chinese NGOs responsible for the care of their constituents did not perceive them as having the right to the best available service. In fact, many NGOs in the social welfare sector were far from providing the best available care for its clients. We found that despite the sort of poor quality of care given to patients or clients in such places such as homes for the mentally disabled, or we found that parents or guardians were afraid to complain in case this may affect the treatment of their loved ones. Seemingly, there appears to be an unequal relationship between the service deliverer, i.e. the Chinese NGO, and the recipients of the service. This relationship may be seen as one that is hierarchical, where the Chinese NGO wields considerable power and restrained apprehension amongst their constituents. At core, this situation may have developed due to the shaky individualistic foundations of many Chinese NGOs. To wit, the founding of Chinese NGOs is often the result of the work of one individual, which leads to questions of collective benefit. The role of the general public in keeping NGOs accountable has taken on many different forms. Methods have included community procurement, where communities hold procurement rights or directly manage the money to buy collective services and goods. Another option is a participatory budget design and monitoring mechanism, where communities make choices on public investment allocations and monitor expenditures. In general, the perception of the general public on NGOs' activities have been mostly positive. This is notably the case where NGOs are seen as working in the community to address social needs and problems. In the near future, however, in order for the general public to take on a greater sort of accountability sort of mechanism, is to have the media as a partner. So there should be greater future partnerships between the public and the media as a way to monitor the activities of NGOs. One of the greatest weaknesses that NGOs face globally is its governing system. And thus, when we look at how to improve the activities of NGOs, there are three things in particular we can point to. The first is an accountable board of directors. We must contemplate the composition, the objectivity, and the effectiveness of a board of directors. There has to be individuals who are experienced and who are not operationally tied to the NGO insofar that they are perhaps the executive director or individuals working on a daily basis with the NGO who are part and the majority of the board of directors. A second sort of idea to improve the activities of NGOs is to understand strategic planning. Strategic planning allows the organization's mission and goals to be attained through the implementation of projects, both in the short and long terms. Generally speaking, many NGOs fail because they do not have a stringent strategic plan, and as follows, they do not hire the right personnel or try to acquire the best resources to work towards their specific goals outlined in the strategic plan. The third prong to improve the activities of NGOs globally is trying to understand their stakeholder involvement sort of procedures. Stakeholder inclusion is a process. It is more than just their participation, but it involves an NGO's ability to effectively communicate their operations, their goals, within the community at large in which they're operating and to their greater stakeholders. This concludes our lecture on accountability and legitimacy. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to the advocacy strategies of NGOs.